In the earliest days of the church, things were hopping. It was exciting. And you can read about it in Acts chapter 5, where it specifically says this, that more than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women. Well, that would be awesome to experience. But in the middle of that rose up a political firestorm, because the current leaders of the nation, the political and national leaders, became very jealous of this Jesus movement. So what they did was they took Peter, all the apostles, and he threw them in jail. That night, as the boys are sitting in jail, Pete and the apostles, an angel shows up, busts them out of jail, and says, hey, you guys go back to the temple, and I want you to keep preaching this message of this words of life. So they do that. They go back to the temple, and they start preaching. Very next morning. Well, as you can imagine, things got very confusing around the business table when people start coming in to tell the high priest and the leaders of the time, hey, you know those guys that you had arrested? They're back in the temple and they're preaching again. High priest, as the guards go, grab the apostles again, drags them in front of the entire leadership council, says, hey, we specifically told you not to proclaim about this Jesus. You are putting Jesus' blood on our hands. Listen to what Peter says. This is in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. And Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Boom. Mic drop, get a t-shirt, make a bumper sticker. These guys must have been Americans. We must obey God and not men. I bring that up because, as many of you probably know and have talked about and have tweeted about and have commented about, our governor in the great state of Ohio, Governor Dewine, has put forth a public mask mandate, meaning that if you go out in public, you are to wear a mask at all times. And that would include going to church. Most of us, I think, knew that this was coming down the pike. But how do you respond to that? I mean, God tells me that I have to wear clothes. My wife tells me what to wear, what matches and what doesn't match. Christians, for as long as I can remember, have been telling me what to wear and what not to wear in church. And now the governor's telling me what to wear? What do I do? How do I respond? I must obey God and not men. Well, as you well know, this has already become a very divisive issue, a very polarizing subject. And inside of it are wrapped up all of these emotions concerning COVID and government and politics and race questions and issues. And so everyone's already on pins and needles. What do we want to do as a Christ follower to respond to this? Let's go back to the Bible and let's go back to the narrative. The early church rose up underneath heinous tyranny and tremendous persecution. So as you can imagine, there's a couple key places within the New Testament where the apostles talk about our responsibility to government and how we should respond to those who are in authority over us. And I want to take just a few minutes to look at some of those, and maybe that will inform how we should respond to what the governor has said. And one of those key places is in the book of Romans, Romans 13. Let me read to you. This is Romans 13, 1 through 7. These would be great verses just to read and meditate on in your own quiet time. This is what the Apostle Paul says. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and thus who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to God's wrath, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all that is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. You have to understand that to these little house churches that Paul was writing to that lived in Rome, there must have been this rise up within them of civil disobedience. They're like, hey, dude, this government hates our guts. Why should we pay taxes to them? They're constantly persecuting us. I mean, we're talking about guys like Claudius and Nero. These are not godly leaders in the slight. But the Apostle Paul says very specifically that we are to be subject to those who are authority over us. And that resisting that authority is an act against God. And that our rulers are there for our good. And he uses this example of paying taxes. Okay, now these people were overtaxed, suffering inhumane rates of taxation. Yet Paul specifically says it is your act of gospel obedience to obey those who are in subject over you. Claudius, who kicked the Jews out of Rome. Nero, who would use Christians as human candles to light up his palace. Powerful words from the Apostle Paul. Peter picks this up in one of his letters. This is in 1 Peter chapter 2. And this is the guy we've just read about in the very beginning of our time. He says, 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 16, 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people, living as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and then he says, honor the emperor. That word honor is the same kind of word we use to talk about God. Give glory to the emperor. Proclaim that he is worthy of being followed. Holy cow. I mean, there was an insurgence of propaganda that said that Christians were they were disobedient, that Christians created civil unrest. And Peter and Paul specifically saying to them, hey, we need to counter this. We should be subject to those who are in authority over us. In fact, we should honor them. We should recognize that they're there as servants of God. And now Jesus goes ahead and he models this. There's an example of this in Matthew 17. This is in Capernaum, where Jesus is ministering, kind of a bit of his home base. And listen to this interaction. This is in Matthew 17, verse 24. They came up to Capernaum. The collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Peter said, "Yes." When he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? For whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" When Peter said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Yep, then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook, and take the fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that, and listen, give it to them for me and for yourself." So here is Jesus being submissive to those who are in authority over him. So these Roman tax collectors said, "Hey, you going to pay your taxes?" And Jesus says, "Hey, we're going to pay our taxes. We do not want to offend them. We don't want to give reason for offense. And so pay the tax. And listen, Peter, do it for myself and do it for you." And I think that's powerful. In what we do, in how we respond to those who are in authority over us, it is an act first to God and second for myself. That there is an act of obedience that is important. My response to those who are in authority over them is a reflection of my response to Jesus. It's like what Paul goes on to say in 1 Thessalonians 4. He says, let's live quiet lives. because outsiders are watching. Outsiders are watching how we respond in social media, how we act out in public, what we do. And part of our gospel testimony is our submission to those who are in authority over us. So how does this then fit in this opening story where Pete flat out disobeys those who are in authority over him? They said, you stop proclaiming the gospel, and Peter says, nope, we must listen to God and not to man. Well, I think if you unpack that, you begin to see an insight in how we need to maneuver whatever information comes for those who are in authority over us, whatever mandates come down. Peter and the apostles were specifically commanded by God to proclaim the gospel. And it was that command that the ruling authorities were trying to stop. It says, hey, you cannot proclaim the gospel. And Pete's like, hey, I have to obey God in this, which means I have to disobey you. And so in that is a key. In that is key. So by obeying the government, they would be disobedient to God. And maybe that is a good filter. By obeying what the government is telling me to do, is it forcing me to be disobedient to God? Okay. By wearing a mask, am I disobeying God in any way? It's not stopping me from singing. It's not stopping me from praying. The governor has not told us to stop meeting as a church. Has not told us to stop preaching the gospel. I can do all of those things and wear a mask. Now, I don't have to like it. I don't want to wear a mask. No one wants to wear a mask. Who wakes up in the morning and says, I'm so excited, I get to put a mask on today? No. I completely sympathize with all of you who are upset about this. I feel those things. I recognize those things. But wearing a mask does not in any way force me to disobey God in any principle or precept that I can find in Scripture. What does that mean for us here? Well, in accordance to the governor's mandate and in obedience to King Jesus, masks are to be worn at House on the Rock Fellowship. There are concessions as you look at what the governor has said, and I would encourage you to go through that information. It has to do with ages of children, those who have previous health conditions, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I would encourage you to read that. But I'd also encourage you to read through those passages that we looked at today. What does Paul say? What does Peter say? How does Jesus live? And how should we respond in the midst of that in today's current crisis with everything else that's going on? I'm not happy. But I want my life to reflect Jesus. I want, like the Apostle Paul said, to become a servant to all. I'm sure you have questions, and there are questions, and I want to walk with you through all of that. I'm thankful for my other colleagues who are leading through this in various ways. Let's have a conversation. Let's sit around the table and let's talk about it. But what will rule the day and win the day is what God has commanded. And that's where we need to land. And it's that creates unity. It is that proclaims the gospel. So let's continue to pray. We have brothers and sisters who have succumbed to COVID. We have brothers and sisters in this area who are dealing with COVID. There is more that's going to be coming down the pike, and so our responsibility is to pray. And wearing a mask certainly does not stop me from doing that. I want my life, my deeds, and my words to do what the apostles did in Acts 5, and that is proclaim the words of life. When we do that, we'll be a great city on a hill that lights it up for a world in darkness. Thank you. God bless.